there's a lot of people out there that have awesome business ideas. They have awesome products and awesome, services. They don't necessarily have the business strength and the business acumen to set up operations, set up a really efficient business system, operating system to allow them to grow, and scale efficiently. So, you see a lot of solo founders, a lot of people with small teams who, they're doing good work, but they need a little push.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. We have a special guest today, Alex. Alex, for people who may not know you yet, can you share a bit about your background and how SourceMate Consulting came to life?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. And my background is in product operations, currently a systems architect for a manufacturing company. But my background has been in operations, finance, and product management, working for startups, as well as companies like Accenture, Meta, and Apple as well throughout my career. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Your background and where and how your company came to life.
And then, yeah, SourceMate. After in about 2023, when there was a big round of layoffs, around the tech world. I was unfortunately, I lost my role at Gemba as a regional director, which was a startup. And so along with, one of my coworkers from Gemba, we came together and we decided to put together a consulting firm to help small businesses set up their operations and business operations. And kind of starting to transform more into AI transformation and data management into how we can help you explore your data better and integrate your data into consolidated views and dashboards, et cetera, operational intelligence. But it mostly, it came from the idea that there's a lot of people out there that have awesome business ideas. They have awesome products and awesome, services, but they don't necessarily have the business strength and the business acumen to set up operations, set up a really efficient business system, operating system to allow them to grow, and scale efficiently. So, you see a lot of solo founders, a lot of people with small teams who, they're doing good work, but they need a little push, to put it that way, to get what they want to be.
What originally pulled you into the world of procurement and sourcing?
Yeah, so when I started off as in Gemba as a client success manager, and we went through very extensive training on the manufacturing process, the differences of manufacturing, for example, in China versus India versus Mexico, and just how global consumer good manufacturing is. Components can come from all over the world, assembled in one place, and then sold in the U.S. market. And I just thought it was fascinating, and I really got into it. I started, reading a lot, studying a lot, and progressing and Gemba from client success to the regional director. And, I just felt that with Gemba, as well as with SourceMate, again, I see these people who have really cool ideas, for products that I can see that can make either a difference or they're just cool, products I would buy myself. But it's a hard world to get into when you're competing against all sorts of different players and setting up your operations to sell that. It's not just about manufacturing, getting it delivered to a warehouse and then just selling. There's a lot that goes on the background to getting those e-commerce operations going and to help them grow and scale.
Was there a particular moment or project where you realized companies struggle much more with sourcing than you think?
Yeah, so we had this one project, which was real. I mean, it was very complex. It was like 100 and something parts, electronics. There was some wireless capabilities to it, plus the physical structure of it. So the components had to be sourced from all over the place. The designers and the founders obviously were very passionate, but they were also very, let's say, closed-minded to feedback and changes. So it made the sourcing process really difficult because small adaptations that the manufacturer had to make or component changes to adapt to the market pricing, we had very tight guardrails. So, it drove the pricing was a lot more expensive than they were expecting to get it manufactured. And then I created a lot of tension in the project because they were so strict in the way they wanted things. I think, a big key is being flexible, understanding obviously you have non-negotiables for your product in terms of quality, etc. But understanding that sometimes a lead time for a component can be 4 months and that throws off your whole launch, of your product. So you have to be flexible and be able to pivot and, think on your feet because I think in manufacturing and sourcing, a lot of people say if things can go wrong, they will go wrong. So you just need to be prepared to pivot and think quickly.
What kind of organizations do you typically work with today?
So right now, my focus is small to medium enterprises. So, I have clients that range from maybe $1 million in revenue a year to 65 to $100 million in revenue. But really, it's in that, small to medium enterprises. That's where I feel, especially with, this whole AI world we're going into, I feel that's where there's a huge gap in the market. You have players like going for the enterprise clients, which is, obviously that's where the big contracts come, et cetera. But there's a big gap and a huge market to address, which is the small and medium enterprises who don't have the budget necessarily to hire AI teams or to hire software developers. Maybe it's not even in their wheelhouse to hire tech. They just have an IT guy and that's it. But now with AI, there's it makes it so much easier to implement, high grade software or custom built software that can, try to level the playing field with these like big enterprise guys as much as possible.
That makes sense. What does a typical engagement with SourceMate Consulting look like?
Yeah, so we start off with a 1 hour free consultation. So, it's more of a business audit conversation, just understanding where you're at with your business, what your vision is, kind of how you separate your departmentally, how some main processes work. After that, we come up with a proposal with, the things we can see just from the top of our heads, like, you can automate this process, or maybe you need to implement a CRM, or you need to know a more sophisticated ERP or EHR, depending what your business is. And then, obviously, if we move forward, then it would be either helping implement those strategies to like implement the ERP, set up the infrastructure, the data management, et cetera, so that you can layer AI on top of it. Or we just go deeper into specific processes to identify how to optimize them and make it better.
When a company first approaches you, what are the most common problems they're trying to solve?
Yeah, so the one I see a lot, especially in the small to medium enterprises, is that data is scattered all over the place. So both that and that, spreadsheets, people work off their own spreadsheets and there's no like single source of truth for data. So, a lot of these companies, you have your finance guy, your sales guy, your operations, and they all kind of work on their each workbook. And then they report what they have individually to management or whatever the structure is. And so what our framework is let's try to consolidate that into a single source of truth for data as a company so that it's not like the CEO has sales data saying 1 million and the CFO has it saying 2 million. There has to be a single source of truth. Where does that data come from? How do we structure it? Is it coming from an ERP? Is it coming from, Shopify? Is it coming from QuickBooks? Identifying the data sources and then trying to consolidate, I don't like the word dashboards. I think it's been like overused a little bit, but more like platforms where you can visualize data as a company and not as siloed departments.
What tends to surprise business the most when they start examining the procurement process?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Just how I think the data reporting part is pretty interesting. I think with every client I've worked, there's always discrepancies. So accounting says one thing, sales says one thing, operations says another thing. So I think them recognizing how the data pipeline is broken, I think it's a big like light bulb for them. It's like, oh, I never, I'm getting insights I never got before. That's something that, we hear a lot after implementing a lot of our SourceMate frameworks.
What does your day-to-day work look like when you're helping a company optimize its sourcing strategy?
It depends a lot on what phase of the project they're in, when they're, especially when you're purchasing in that phase, when you've got your samples, you're about to place an order. There's a lot of back and forth just because it's logistics, placing the order, you have to make sure dates and payments go out. So those are pretty intense. It can mean going to the bank maybe 2 or 3 times a day to send an international wire. A lot of correspondence, via the phone and WhatsApp with manufacturers and providers just to make sure everything is aligned. But a lot of my day to day is getting on calls and talking to my clients, understanding where they're at, how they're feeling about the process, kind of going over, the key items to help them grow their business. So it's either we need to talk about our marketing strategy. Do we need to hire somebody? Do we need to make sure we have our warehousing? Let's make sure that our warehouse vendor, how they can do drop shipping, explore the different opportunities for like 3PLs, et cetera, try to optimize costing. And then just kind of, I try to understand the business as much as possible. That way I can try to, make things connect as a full system.
Okay. The last few years have been turbulent for global supply chains. What major shifts are you seeing right now?
So, I think things are still rough, especially with the political landscape, now with the war with Iran, just in general, it feels like supply chains are just getting disrupted all the time. You had COVID, that was huge. I think we're still haven't recovered 100% from COVID. I feel like we were trying to get there, and then the war in Iran and the war, what was happening in the Caribbean, and then all these the war in Russia, obviously, it's made pricing very volatile in terms of logistics, like shipping lanes, sourcing and procurement of raw materials. If you don't buy your raw materials in the US, are the tariffs 10% now? Are they 15% tomorrow? Are they, you don't understand how to navigate that forecasting portion. And I think that's a big distribution, logistics, and procurement, et cetera. It's a lot about forecasting and predicting what's going to happen so that you can, mitigate those risks as much as possible, make sure you don't run out of inventory, make sure your supply chain and manufacturing chain are running smoothly. And with all these unpredictable factors going on, it's really hard for, distribution companies and manufacturing companies to forecast long term in terms of especially financial forecasting because you don't know, you know, what's going to happen. Is your ship going to be stuck 3 months somewhere because it can't move? Are your tariffs going to go up 20% in one day? Or is it going to be held up in customs because the laws changed? There's a lot of like uncertainty of how things are going to move forward.
How have procurement strategies how have procurement strategies evolved since the supply chain disruptions?
Yeah, so I think, there's like twofold, especially early COVID to late COVID, it was more about adapting. There was a lot of nearshoring. So a lot of, when I was at Gemba, that was like the peak of COVID, I would say. The main conversations we were having from people is how do I get out of China and go to India or go to Mexico or go to Brazil or Colombia because of the uncertainties that COVID was causing, and how long it was taking to get things over from China to the US. So there was a lot of exploring into moving to like closer markets. India is still far, but especially Mexico, we had a lot of work to move people to Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, for example, Argentina. So we saw a lot of that movement. So I felt it was not necessarily the strategies of how you procure. It was more a geographical change. Instead of relying solely on Asia and China, we started exploring Western Hemisphere and local, a lot of US sourcing. We had a lot of people asking for US based manufacturers as well.
Thank you for sharing. What technologies or tools are starting to reshape how sourcing and vendor management are done?
Yeah, so there's a lot of, obviously AI has touched every single industry. So there's a lot of, procurement platforms that can help, predict and forecast um, your stock. It's not just raw materials, but your inventory stock and understand based on your sales. Um, when you're going to run out of those. There's also procurement for example, finding new factories, a lot of patenting AI as well, where you can, just like I feel like the main technological advantages of AI are just making things faster. I feel like procurement and sourcing historically was, relatively slow depending on what you're buying, where you're purchasing from, et cetera. But it was a slower process. There was a lot of relationship involved in knowing your supplier, knowing your vendor. You had a tight list or community. I feel like with AI now it's making it a lot more globalized, surprisingly, and just making it faster. So you have all these like lead generators and, procurement platforms that help you connect with people a lot quicker and speed up the process.
Definitely, there's a lot of growth with AI.
Yeah.
Where would you see SourceMate Consulting to be in the next 6 to 12 months?
Ideally we would love to keep serving the small to medium business community because we do feel, especially in the tech and AI portion, they are underserved. There's a lot of consulting companies out there, but they all target the big fish, I would say, or most of them do. So helping these small, medium enterprises to at least grow, and make them have access to tools that the big players have without having to spend that amount of money. I think that's, first of all, it's very helpful for them, but it's very fulfilling, at least for me, to see, a small business person grow their business and be able to like expand. I feel it's like, yeah, it's rewarding. I root for the smaller guys in general.
Are there any new services or capabilities you're planning to introduce?
Yeah, so we have, SourceMate started, like I said, as we were helping e-commerce establish their operations, and we still, that's the core of our business. But we are exploring, DataMate. So DataMate is like a service we provide with SourceMate, which is our data and operations intelligence system. So it's a framework we've developed, through working with several clients on how to optimize and operationalize business intelligence. So how do you capture all this knowledge that businesses have, not just data, but training, conversation, emails, etc. And how do you, condense that into a view that can be actionable for companies? So how do you get all this data, all this information that you have tribal knowledge and operationalize it so that you can grow your business? And so it all makes sense and stays in context. So that's where it's an initiative. We've been doing that for about 6 to 8 months. And so far we've had a lot of success.
What kind of clients or projects excites you the most right now?
Right now, yeah. So I'm my business partner. He's still focusing more on the sourcing and the procurement. That's his specialty. I'm more focused now on the data mate. That's my initiative, and everyone that's kind of pulling it forward. We have a couple projects of custom built platforms for some company that we're working with that I think are pretty cool. So just knowing that now we have the power of building these operational platforms that would cost, 300, $500,000 for clients, and we're doing it for a fraction of the price. And they're actually changing the way they operate for the better. Like now they'll have more decisions.
Okay, let's see here. What's the one sourcing lesson you learned the hard way early in your career?
That's a good question. I think it's always cover your bases. So like I said, when things can go wrong, they will go wrong. So just know, very early in my Gamba career, I think I trusted and relied on suppliers a little too much. And it's not that you don't need to trust them and not rely on them, but just understand that things change very quickly and things can go wrong very quickly. So always have a backup plan. So I think that's something I learned early that stuck with me till this day, how I work.
If a founder or operations leader is listening right now, what's one procurement habit they should fix immediately?
I think a lot of people take inventory for granted. I think that keeping, renegotiating with your vendors, especially on quantities and pricing, depending on the demand and your forecasts, I think that's a habit that, if you can do that every quarter or every certain amount of time, not only you can save money by renegotiating pricing, but you get a better understanding of the landscape and what's going on with your supplier. And if you need to pivot to a different supplier, you can do that with plenty of time and not in a rush situation because your supplier closed shop or because they, now their lead times are 6 months instead of 3 weeks. So, I think just keeping that open conversations with your vendors and suppliers constantly is the key to success when it comes to, sourcing and procurement.
That's a pretty valuable insight. What's one trend in procurement that leaders should start paying attention to right now?
One trend, I would say, I think that keeping the nearshoring trend is something that's really important and valuable. Not because I don't believe in Asian manufacturing. I think, China, et cetera, they're a powerhouse and they always will be. But especially, like I said, for the smaller, the medium guys, trying to cut costs where you can without compromising quality is part of that operational growth. And, Mexico, Latin America, me also being a Latino, I have some of that pride where I want to get things towards our side of the world as well, but there's a lot of capable manufacturers and capable people closer to the US who can provide very similar or not better services for, cheaper in the long run. So I think just staying up with that nearshoring trend that we saw during COVID, I think, it's a strategy. It's going to be expensive to move your supply chain from China to Mexico in the first place. But I think in the long run, you can see a lot more benefits from being that much closer and just being something made by people that are closer, just cheaper.
Is always cheaper, especially with these gas prices.
Yeah, exactly.
If someone wanted to build a resilient supply chain today, what would be the first step
Are they starting from zero or
from zero?
from zero? So like I said, I think having a plan B, plan C, especially in manufacturing, when you're, in that phase of exploring your first vendor, and you want to sign a contract with your first vendor to start going to market, I think having backup plans to that vendor. So you just don't rely on just one. And just understanding, what it looks like to move to a different vendor and understanding what your options are. as well as the more you know about how things work in your segment or your niche, I think the better the more leverage you have when it comes to negotiating pricing and payment terms, as well as I think understanding 3PL. A lot of people also take that for granted, like warehousing, drop shipping, 3PL. If you're a business in California, you don't necessarily want your warehouse in New York. They may be that they're just going to be if you're selling the majority of stuff in California, but you'd have to make sure that you're taking into account geography, pricing, vendor relationships, and always having a backup plan.
Okay. Let's see here. Where do you currently use AI in your own business? Out of curiosity.
Yeah, so I use AI a lot to, especially when it comes to prototyping the platforms, the custom builds that we're doing. So we use software like Lovable, Claude Code, Replit, for example, Cursor. So when we're presenting concepts, especially on the datamate side, when we're presenting concepts of the platforms and the custom builds that we're building, we can just quickly iterate and move quickly instead of having to present like wireframes and Figma images. I think it provides more value if you have like an actual clickable prototype that kind of works like the app. It captures your attention pretty quickly. And then on the sourcing and, the procurement side for e-commerce, a lot of, Perplexity, ChatGPT, et cetera, for market research, for finding competitors, analyzing pricing, versus other competitors, more for the knowledge of understanding the market segment that we're helping, a specific client. And then, well, we built an internal tool for us, which is like a lead generator for us. We manage our invoicing through that platform, et cetera. So we embedded some AI, but it was mostly built by AI with like Claude
So
Code.
basically, you build most of the stuff using Claude. I love it.
Yeah, I use a lot of Claude. I use, obviously ChatGPT I use a lot, but for the coding portion, a lot of Lovable, a lot of Claude Code specifically, and, just research.
Let's see. When you analyze a company procurement operations, where do the biggest inefficiencies usually hide?
So I see a lot of inefficiencies in AR and AP. So, keeping track of your collections efficiency versus how quickly you pay your bills. I think that's a trap in cash flow that a lot of people don't realize. If you don't collect your bills in 120 days, but you're paying your bills at 10 days, your cash flow is always going to be imbalanced towards the AP. So you have to make sure that your collections are efficient enough that if you're collecting at 120 days, then you need to make sure you're balancing out how you pay your bills or increase your efficiency. So if you're only collecting 20% of your bills on time, how do you increase that to maybe 30, 40%? And that's going to make a big impact on your cash flow and working capital. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is just internal communications also. I think there's a lot of fragmentation in internal communications within businesses, especially now with having WhatsApp, Slack, email, things get lost when you can be having a conversation with a vendor on WhatsApp, and then your partner or your investor or one of your team members is like, "Oh, I can't find this information." And it's like, "Oh yeah, because it's on WhatsApp, but this person doesn't have access to that WhatsApp conversation." So there's a lot that gets lost there. So I think, consolidating internal communications is key and just having one or two channels like email, Slack, or email, WhatsApp, and trying to maintain those as constrained as possible. Let's put it that way.
What are the most common mistakes companies make when selecting vendors or suppliers?
Most common mistakes. I think price. If they go only by pricing, price is only one part of the formula. It's if you're working with the best manufacturer, let's say the best can maker in the world, that's something that you might need to consider for when you're the price you're paying. If you always look for the cheaper price and where find the cheaper price, you're probably going to risk quality at some point. So I think that focusing too much on one factor of the manufacturing or the vendor process. So for example, saying like, "Oh, I want the cheapest person," or "I want the best quality," or then that really narrows your vision. So like I said, you have to be flexible. You have to be able to think on your feet and take it all as like a system view, not just manufacturing, like the quality or the price. Like, is it close to my warehouse? How much is the logistics going to cost to get there? How good are they? What is the price? What is their response time to my emails? Do they pick up the phone when I call? Are they willing to negotiate pricing in the future? You need to take all of that into consideration. Their lead times when you're making a decision. So I just think like don't try to be too tunnel visioned and only like one thing is important. You have to see everything as a whole and as a system for it to be effective and work correctly.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Um, how much of your procurement today is still manual or spreadsheet driven, if you have any?
So it really depends on the client we're working with and what their processes are. Some of them already have established, they use procurement portals already. Maybe they're, SAP or, they have any of these portals where they manage it automatically. If they are on spreadsheets, we usually try to push them towards a more advanced solution depending on their size. So either going into SAP or, building them a custom portal for their procurement. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
What metrics should companies really be tracking when it comes to sourcing performance?
I would say lead times, their adherence to lead times, so how quickly they do, how many times they're on time, late, early, etc. Pricing volatility, if they're changing pricing on you every order, then maybe that's something you might need to either have a conversation about or explore to see if that's normal, see what's happening with other vendors, as well as quality depending on, how you want to rank that and the quality of the service they're providing.
Where do organizations tend to lose the most money in procurement without realizing it?
I think mostly for procurement, I think is when you stick with a relationship, maybe like I said, without negotiating pricing or renegotiating pricing after a certain amount of times of time. I think there can be, you can find ways where you can adjust pricing with your vendor, either lower, it can fluctuate. So I think that if you stay at the same pricing all the time, like it looks advantageous, but there could be opportunities where you could lower your pricing with your manufacturer if you renegotiate terms. And I also feel logistics, shipping lanes are really, really unpredictable right now. So having a clear plan and understanding different options, if you only rely on one logistics partner, they might be a little more expensive than what you could find if you just, looked elsewhere, to put it that way.
Well, that was some pretty amazing insight. Do you have anything else you wanted to share? Many stories or successes?
No, I think I appreciate the questions. That was awesome.
All right, let's do the closing. So, thank you for joining the podcast today. Absolute pleasure hearing your insights and your depth knowledge in procurement. And wish hopefully we'll see you again. See you in our next podcast.
Yeah, I would appreciate it. And I wish you the best of luck and hope to talk to you soon.
Likewise. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.